Templars were guilty simply because the official records of the French crown, written in the ink of the Inquisition, insisted they were. However, in the early 21st century, a discovery within the Vatican's secret archives fundamentally altered our understanding of the secret that brought down the order. The Chinon parchment, a document that had been misfiled for centuries, proved that Pope Clement V had actually absolved Jacques de Molay and the leadership of the Temple of all charges of heresy as early as 1308. This revelation confirms the ultimate betrayal. The Pope knew the order was innocent, yet he allowed them to be systematically tortured and burned to appease the political and financial demands of the French king. This document is the smoking gun of a judicial murder, a testament to a period where the highest spiritual authority on earth was held hostage by sovereign debt. The biological extinction of the direct Cape Tion line in 1328 was not the end of the tragedy, but the beginning of a century of chaos that nearly destroyed the concept of France itself. The transition to the House of Valois was marked by immediate internal strife and the arrival of the Black Death, a pandemic that found Europe already weakened by the economic instability caused by the Templars' fall. The absence of the order's international banking network meant that there was no centralized mechanism to manage the massive economic contractions that followed the plague. The curse had manifested as a total systemic failure. The Hundred Years' War, which erupted as a direct result of the Cape Tion succession crisis, saw the French nobility decimated at the battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. The irony of history is profound. The very state that Philip the Fair sought to make the most powerful in the world was reduced to a fractured, occupied territory, its people suffering for generations under the weight of a conflict that was rooted in the betrayal of 1307. The gold seized from the order's vaults had long since been spent on the very wars that were now destroying the kingdom, proving that wealth obtained through the subversion of justice carries a terminal interest rate. The geopolitical consequences of this collapse extended far beyond the borders of France, fundamentally altering the map of the world. Without the Templar fleet and their logistical support in the Mediterranean, the Christian presence in the East became even more precarious, leading to the final abandonment of the crusading ideal and the rise of the Ottoman Empire as the dominant power in the region. In Europe, the vacuum left by the Templars allowed other, less regulated financial powers to rise, but it also increased the frequency of localized conflicts that the Templars had once been able to mediate through their immense financial influence. The secret that brought down kings was the realization that absolute power, when exercised through the destruction of fundamental institutions, creates a systemic rot that cannot be cured by seized assets. As we look at the records of the French court in the years following 1314, we see a tragic parade of short-lived monarchs and a nobility that had lost its faith in the crown, leading to a breakdown of the social contract that would take centuries to repair. The memory of the Templars migrated from the legal archives into the folklore of secret societies and the esoteric traditions of the Renaissance, where the fantasy of hidden treasures and holy relics began to take root. While modern historians focus on the documented reality of their banking and military prowess, the cultural impact of their fall remains immense. During the French Revolution, nearly 500 years after the pyres on the Seine, the execution of King Louis XVI was viewed by some as the final settlement of the Templar debt. Legends even claim that as the guillotine fell, a voice from the crowd shouted, "Jacques de Molay, thou art avenged." While these stories are the product of revolutionary romanticism, they demonstrate the enduring power of the narrative. A state that builds its foundation on the blood of the innocent creates a ghost that it can never truly lay to rest. The pyre on the Isle de Juifs had lit a fire that would eventually consume the very concept of the absolute monarchy. The physical legacy of the order remains scattered across the landscape of Europe, silent, stone commanderies and massive fortresses that once held the wealth of nations. These structures serve as monuments to an era of internationalism that was destroyed by framing the order as a secret society of heretics who had betrayed the very faith they swore to protect. Philip created the moral and legal vacuum necessary to bypass papal authority and move against the Knights under the guise of an emergency defense of Christendom. The logistical execution of the arrests on the morning of Friday, October 13, 1307, remains a chilling testament to the efficiency of the French administrative machine. In an age where communication traveled at the speed of a horse, Philip managed to coordinate the simultaneous opening of sealed orders by royal seneschals across every province of France. At dawn, thousands of knights and sergeants were taken into custody without a single blow being struck. They were caught in their beds or at prayer, completely unaware that their king had turned into their executioner. Jacques de Molay was arrested in Paris, just hours after attending the funeral of the king's sister-in-law. The shockwaves of this mass arrest shattered the medieval world's sense of security. Never before had a sovereign king moved so aggressively against a sacred order of the church. The royal officers did not just seize the men, they seized the ledgers, the inventory of the commanderies, and the contents of the vaults, ensuring that every ounce of Templar wealth was placed under royal guard. Once in custody, the machinery of the Inquisition was turned against the knights. The medieval legal system allowed for the use of torture as a legitimate means of extracting a confession, which was considered the ultimate proof of guilt. In the dungeons of the Temple and the Châtelet, the knights were subjected to horrifying physical trauma. They were placed on the rack to dislocate their limbs, had their legs compressed in iron boots that crushed bone, and were subjected to the application of burning fat to the soles of their feet. The goal of the interrogators was not to discover the truth, but to force the knights to recite a pre-written script of heresy that would justify the king's actions. Jacques de Molay, an old soldier who had spent his life in the service of the order, was not immune to this pressure. Under the weight of isolation and the threat of further agony, he signed a confession admitting to the denial of Christ. This admission was the king's greatest propaganda victory, as it allowed Philip to present the order to the rest of Europe as a corrupt institution that had collapsed from within. However, the legal struggle for the Temple's legacy would last for 7 grueling years. Pope Clement V, although a protégé of Philip and residing in Avignon under French influence, recognized that the king's actions were a direct assault on papal jurisdiction. He initially suspended the proceedings, attempting to assert that only the Church had the right to judge the Templars. This sparked a vicious political and diplomatic war between the Crown and the papacy. Philip countered by using the Estates General to endorse his actions, effectively utilizing the will of the people to bypass the Pope's authority. Whenever a knight attempted to retract his confession and defend the order, Philip responded with lethal force. In May 1310, 54 Templars who had declared their innocence were burned at the stake as relapsed heretics on the outskirts of Paris. This act of judicial terror served its purpose. It silenced the defense and signaled to the Pope that Philip would burn the entire order to the ground rather than lose the case. The tragedy of the Templars was finalized at the Council of Vienne in 1312. Clement V, exhausted by the struggle and fearing a formal schism or a French invasion of the Papal States, issued the bull Vox in excelso. The Pope admitted that while the charges of heresy were not legally proven, the order was so tarnished by the scandal that it could no longer function. He dissolved the Templars by administrative decree, officially transferring their properties to the Knights Hospitaller. In reality, Philip ensured that the French crown was heavily compensated for the astronomical costs of the trial, effectively draining the Templar treasury before it could ever reach the Hospitallers. The king had achieved his objective, the debt was erased, the gold was seized, and the most powerful independent organization in his kingdom was no more. The transition from a feudal world of shared religious loyalties to one of absolute sovereign power was finalized in the smoke of the inquisitorial fires. To truly understand the scale of this first chapter, one must visualize the transition of Europe from a feudal mosaic of overlapping loyalties into a landscape of absolute sovereign states. The Templars were the last obstacle to the modern state as Philip the Fair envisioned it. They were too international, too wealthy, and too independent. Their fall was the birth of the era of the reason of state, where the law is not a tool of justice, but a weapon of the ruler. The narrative of the Temple's fall is not one of occultism, but of the secret mechanics of power. Every ledger, every sword, and every piece of land that once belonged to the poor fellow soldiers of Christ was now a tool of the French crown. Yet, the moral vacuum created by this unprecedented act of state violence began to resonate through the corridors of power. The knights who died in the dungeons and the leaders who languished in chains became symbols of a broken covenant between the king and his people. Philip had won the financial war, but he had lost the spiritual mandate that had sustained the Capetian dynasty for centuries. The administrative death of the order left France in a state of internal tension. The economic stability that the Templars provided, the safe roads, the reliable credit, the international logistics, began to falter. The king had seized the gold, but he could not replicate the trust that the Templar letter of credit represented. As the years of imprisonment dragged on for Jacques de Molay, the silence of the dungeons became a breeding ground for a new kind of power, the power of the martyr. The king believed he had closed the book on the Templars, but he had only succeeded in transforming a political crime into a metaphysical legend. The debt of blood was mounting, and the survivors, broken in body but perhaps not in spirit, were waiting for their final moment on the stage of history. The first act of the betrayal was complete, and as the year 1314 approached, the world stood on the precipice of a transformation that would be heralded not by the stroke of a pen, but by the roar of a funeral pyre on the banks of the Seine. This foundation of the documentary is built upon the thousands of pages of interrogation transcripts, royal ledgers, and papal bulls that survive to this day. They tell a story of a world undergoing a violent birth, where the old structures of the Middle Ages were being torn down to make way for the absolute power of the monarch. The secret that brought down kings was the realization that in the pursuit of total control, even the most sacred oaths could be discarded, and even the most powerful warriors could be reduced to dust. Jacques de Molay's path from the halls of power to the cold stones of the temple prison serves as the ultimate warning of the consequences of institutional greed and royal hubris. As we prepare to move into the final confrontation, the image of the Grand Master remains a haunting reminder of the cost of defiance in an age of iron. The legal maneuvers, the diplomatic betrayals, and the physical agony of the knights were all merely precursors to the moment when the last Grand Master would find his voice again and deliver a summons that would echo through the centuries, pulling the entire House of France into the abyss. The transition from the administrative dissolution of the order to the final, violent confrontation in the heart of Paris marks the moment where a political execution transcended history to become a metaphysical legend. By the early months of 1314, King Philip IV believed that the threat posed by the Knights Templar had been entirely neutralized. The order's properties had been legally reassigned, its financial records absorbed into the royal bureaucracy, and its members scattered or silenced. All that remained was the final sentencing of the four highest-ranking dignitaries who had survived 7 years of sensory deprivation and psychological warfare in the dungeons of the temple. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, Geoffroy de Charny, the Preceptor of Normandy, Hugues de Perraud, and Geoffroy de Gonneville were brought before a public assembly on March 18, 1314. The setting was a high platform erected in the square before the Cathedral of Notre Dame, a stage specifically designed to showcase the total victory of the French crown and the papacy over the fallen knights. The intention of the judges was to read a sentence of life imprisonment, a verdict predicated on the condition that the four men would once again publicly confess their alleged crimes and accept the mercy of the Church. To the gathered crowd of royal officials, prelates, and Parisian citizens, the event was expected to be a mere formality, a final, submissive act of contrition that would permanently validate Philip's accusations of heresy. However, as the sentences were being read, the internal resolve of the two most senior knights reached a breaking point. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny did not bow their heads in submission. Instead, they stood up and addressed the crowd with a clarity and strength that shocked the cardinal judges. Molay declared that the confessions he had signed years earlier were not a reflection of truth, but the result of the unbearable agony of torture and the manipulative promises of his captors. He stated that the order of the temple was holy, pure, and innocent of every charge of heresy, and that his greatest sin was not the blasphemies he had been accused of, but the betrayal of his brothers by confessing to lies to save his own life. By publicly retracting his confession, Molay committed a deliberate act of judicial suicide. Under the strict definitions of inquisitorial law, a prisoner who recanted a confession after sentencing was classified as a relapsed heretic, a status that carried a mandatory and immediate sentence of death by fire without further appeal. The news of this defiance reached Philip IV in the nearby Palais de la Cite, and his reaction was swift and merciless. He bypassed the ecclesiastical authorities and ordered that Molay and Charny be executed at sunset that very same day. The site chosen was a small, marshy island in the Seine known as the Isle de Juifs, situated in the shadow of the royal palace. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the two men were bound to stakes amidst a pyre of slow-burning wood. It was during these final moments that the historical record merges with the chilling details of the curse. As the flames began to consume the wood, Jacques de Molay did not beg for mercy or cry out in pain. Instead, he utilized his final moments to issue a formal judicial summons to the architects of his destruction. His voice, steady and projected over the roar of the fire, called upon Pope Clement V and King Philip the Fair to meet him before the tribunal of God within the year to account for their crimes against the temple. He warned that the House of France would be cursed to the 13th generation, a prophecy that would soon be tested by the brutal reality of medieval mortality. The smoke from the pyre had barely dissipated before the first of the condemned began to fall. Pope Clement V, a man who had suffered from chronic abdominal pain and failing health throughout his papacy, was the first to succumb. On April 20, 1314, exactly 33 days after the execution of the Grand Master, the Pope died at Roquemaure. The accounts of his death were grisly. Contemporary chroniclers noted that his body was left in a church that was subsequently struck by lightning, causing a fire that partially incinerated the remains of the man who had allowed the order to be sacrificed for political expediency. To the public, the timing was too precise to be a coincidence. The first part of the Grand Master's summons had been fulfilled, and the attention of the kingdom turned toward the Louvre and the person of Philip the Fair. The king, who had ruled France with an iron fist for nearly 30 years, appeared to be in the prime of his power, but his internal world was beginning to collapse under the weight of personal and dynastic scandals. The most devastating of these was the Tour de Nesle affair, which broke out shortly after the execution. Philip's 3 daughters-in-law were accused of adultery, a crime that struck at the very heart of the Capetian dynasty's legitimacy. The scandal resulted in the execution of the knights involved and the imprisonment of the princesses, leaving the future of the French succession in a state of profound uncertainty. The psychological and physical strain on the king grew immense. In November 1314, while hunting in the forest of Pont Saint-Maxence, the Iron King suffered a sudden and mysterious cerebral event, a stroke that rendered him speechless and paralyzed. He was carried back to Fontainebleau, where he lingered in a state of agonizing silence for several weeks. On November 29, 1314, Philip the Fair died at the age of 46. Within 8 months of the execution on the Isle de Juifs, both the Pope and the King were dead, precisely as the last Grand Master had prophesied. The sudden deaths of the two most powerful men in Christendom created a vacuum that the medieval mind could only interpret as divine intervention. The scientific and historical reality points to a confluence of factors: Clement's long-standing illness and Philip's extreme stress and high-protein diet, which likely contributed to a stroke. However, in the context of the 14th century, these naturalistic explanations were irrelevant. The curse had become a documented historical force, a tangible manifestation of the moral decay of the state. The king had seized the gold of the Templars and dismantled their physical empire, but in doing so, he had destroyed the spiritual foundation of his own dynasty. The administrative brilliance of Philip's reign was replaced by the chaotic and short-lived rule of his 3 sons, each of whom would wear the crown for only a few years before dying without a male heir. The House of Capet, which had provided an unbroken line of succession for over 3 centuries, was suddenly facing extinction. To further analyze this period, we must look at the immediate economic shock that followed the king's death. Philip had destroyed the most stable financial institution in Europe, and his successors lacked the administrative genius to manage the resulting chaos. The royal treasury, though momentarily bolstered by the seized Templar assets, was quickly drained by the costs of the transition and the escalating tensions with the nobility. The centralizing work of Philip IV began to unravel as local lords took advantage of the weak reigns of his sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV. This internal instability was compounded by the onset of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which decimated the population of France and destroyed the agricultural tax base. The curse was no longer just a story of dead kings, it was the lived reality of a kingdom in decline. the geopolitical consequences were equally severe. Without the Templar fleet and their logistical support in the Mediterranean, the Christian presence in the East became even more precarious, and the dream of recovering the Holy Land effectively died with Jacques de Molay. In Europe, the vacuum left by the Templars allowed other powers to rise, but it also increased the frequency of localized conflicts that the Templars had once been able to mediate through their financial influence. The secret that brought down kings was the realization that absolute power, when exercised through betrayal and the subversion of the law, creates a systemic rot that cannot be cured by seized gold. As we look at the records of the French court in the years following 1314, we see a tragic parade of short-lived monarchs and a nobility that had lost its faith in the crown. Jacques de Molay's final summons had acted as a catalyst for a historical correction, a violent rebalancing of a world that had been tilted too far toward the whims of a single tyrant. The stage was now set for the final disintegration of the direct Cape-Town line and the arrival of a new era of even more devastating warfare. The biological and political disintegration of the direct Cape-Town line following the death of Philip the Fair serves as one of the most chilling and statistically improbable sequences of dynastic failure in the history of the Western world. To understand the depth of this collapse, one must move beyond the supernatural and examine the systematic failure of the House of France to produce a viable heir, a phenomenon that contemporary chroniclers could only attribute to the lingering spiritual and legal debt of the Templar execution. Philip the Fair had left behind a seemingly invincible legacy, 3 healthy, adult sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, and a daughter, Isabella, who was the Queen of England. This was a situation that should have guaranteed the stability of the French crown for at least another century. In the medieval mindset, a full quiver of heirs was the ultimate sign of divine favor. Instead, the kingdom entered a frantic, 14-year period of sudden deaths, suspicious illnesses, and internal revolts that would ultimately lead to the absolute extinction of a 300-year-old dynasty. This was not merely the death of a family, it was the shattering of the administrative and moral framework of the most powerful state in Europe, a state that had been built on the ashes of the Templar order. The first to ascend the throne was Louis X, known as the Quarreler. His reign, beginning in 1314, was immediately defined by a violent reaction against the centralized iron rule of his father. The French nobility, having felt the weight of Philip the Fair's heavy taxation and administrative overreach, saw the transition as an opportunity to reclaim their feudal privileges. Louis was a monarch who lacked his father's cold discipline and intellectual focus. He spent much of his short reign attempting to appease the regional leagues of nobles who were threatening open rebellion. His rule was further crippled by the lingering shadow of the Tour de Nesle scandal, which had seen his first wife, Margaret of Burgundy, imprisoned for adultery. This scandal did more than just break a marriage, it poisoned the very concept of the sanctity of the bloodline that the Capetians had spent centuries cultivating. In June 1316, after a strenuous and overheated game of tennis at Vincennes, Louis consumed a large quantity of chilled wine and died suddenly at the age of 26. His death triggered the first major succession crisis in the history of the House of Capet. Since his only daughter's legitimacy was questioned due to her mother's adultery, and his second wife, Clementia of Hungary, was still pregnant, the kingdom was left in a state of paralysis. The birth of his son, John I, known as the Posthumous, seemed to offer a divine reprieve, but the infant king lived for only 5 days. His death remains one of the great mysteries of history, with many at the time suspecting that the infant was removed or murdered to clear the way for his uncle. The crown then passed to Philip's second son, Philip V, known as the Tall. Philip V was perhaps the only one of the brothers who inherited his father's administrative genius. He was a visionary reformer who attempted to revitalize the royal treasury, which had been drained by his brother's concessions to the nobility. He sought to standardize weights and measures across the realm and professionalize the royal bureaucracy to ensure that the king's law was enforced in every corner of France. However, his reign was plagued by a series of social and environmental catastrophes that the populace interpreted as clear signs of divine disfavor. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already decimated the peasantry, and Philip's reign saw the rise of the Shepherd's Crusade, a violent and chaotic movement of the poor that spiraled into a wave of anti-Semitic pogroms and attacks on the clergy. This was followed by the leper scare, a mass hysteria fueled by rumors that lepers, Jews, and foreign kings were conspiring to poison the wells of France. The kingdom was in a state of constant, vibrating anxiety, as if the land itself were rejecting the rule of the Capetians. Despite his reforms and his attempt to stabilize the state, Philip V failed in the one area that truly mattered for a medieval monarch. He failed to produce a male heir who survived to adulthood. When he died in 1322 after a short and mysterious illness, the crown passed to the third and final son of Philip the Fair, Charles IV. Charles IV, known as the Fair, like his father, found himself presiding over a kingdom that was increasingly isolated and economically stagnant. His reign was a period of legalistic stagnation and growing military tension with England over the territories in Aquitaine. Charles's inability to produce a male heir became an obsession of the court and a source of national dread. He married 3 times, searching desperately for a way to break the perceived curse on the House of France. Each pregnancy was watched with bated breath, and each failure to produce a son was seen as another nail in the coffin of the dynasty. By 1328, the desperation was palpable. When Charles IV died without a male successor, the direct line of Hugh Capet, the line that had ruled France in an unbroken father-to-son succession since the year 987, was officially and irrevocably extinct. This was a biological impossibility in the eyes of the medieval world. For 3 centuries, the Capetians had been the miraculous dynasty that never failed to produce an heir. Now, in the span of just 14 years after the smoke rose from the pyre of Jacques de Molay, the entire branch had been pruned by death. The secret that brought down kings was the realization that the destruction of a foundational institution like the Templars had removed the financial and moral anchor of the state. The wealth Philip the Fair had seized, the gold, the lands, the commanderies, proved to be a hollow prize. The costs of the succession crises, the social unrest, and the administrative chaos far outweighed the liquid assets gained from the liquidation of the order. The transition of power to the House of Valois, through Philip VI, was not a peaceful evolution but a contested seizure. It provided the English king, Edward III, who was the grandson of Philip the Fair through his daughter Isabella, the perfect legal pretext to claim the French throne for himself. This dynastic dispute ignited the 100 Years' War, a conflict of unprecedented brutality that would see France burned, occupied, and nearly destroyed. The curse of Jacques de Molay was not a magical spell, but a sequence of historical cause and effect. The king had destroyed the rule of law to solve a debt, and in doing so, he had invited the lawlessness of a century of war. The geopolitical consequences of the Capetian collapse extended far beyond the borders of France. The loss of the Templars had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Without the Templar fleet and their international logistical network, the Christian states in the East lost their primary financial and military backbone. This absence allowed for the rise of new powers and the eventual fragmentation of the crusading ideal. In Europe, the collapse of the Templar banking system led to a period of financial volatility where international credit was harder to obtain and significantly more expensive. The Italian banking houses that tried to fill the void, such as the Bardi and the Peruzzi, eventually faced their own ruin because they lent money to the same monarchs who had learned from Philip the Fair that it was easier to destroy a creditor than to pay a debt. The secret was the realization that an economy built on betrayal and the seizure of assets is inherently unsustainable and leads to the degradation of the very markets the state relies upon to survive. By the mid-14th century, as the Black Death began to sweep across a continent already broken by decades of war and famine, the memory of the Templars shifted in the public consciousness. They were no longer the accused heretics of Philip's propaganda. They were remembered as the martyr defenders of a lost age of stability and honor. The records of the trials, though kept under lock and key, became a source of terror for the new Valois kings, who struggled to maintain the legitimacy that the Capetians had lost in the dungeons of the temple. The fall of the dynasty was a historical lesson in the limits of absolute power. Philip the Fair had sought to create a state that was a god unto itself, but he discovered that even a king is subject to the laws of consequence. The debt of the Templars had been settled in coin, but the interest was being paid in the blood of the French nobility and the total collapse of the social order. The final summons from the pyre was not just a call to individual men, it was a summons to a kingdom that had traded its soul for a treasury full of blood-stained gold. As the Valois dynasty struggled to establish its authority, it found itself haunted by the administrative ghost of Philip the Fair. The bureaucracy he created continued to function, but without the centralizing force of a strong, legitimate monarch, it became a tool for factional infighting. The curse had effectively decapitated the French state, leaving it in a state of perpetual civil and international conflict. The 100 Years' War was the physical manifestation of this moral vacuum. From the slaughter at the Battle of Crécy to the devastation of the Black Prince's chevauchés, France suffered under the weight of a conflict that was rooted in the failure of the Capetian succession. The Iron King had wanted to leave a legacy of power; instead, he left a legacy of ash. The tragedy of the Templars and the fall of the Capetians are inextricably linked, forming a single narrative of hubris, betrayal, and the inevitable correction of history. The debt of the Templars was not just a financial one, it was a debt of honor, and until it was paid in full through the suffering of the nation, the shadow of Jacques de Molay would continue to loom over the French throne. This section of the documentary explores the minute details of the royal births, the failed marriages, and the desperate attempts of the last Capetians to secure their line. It examines the medical records of the era, the political treaties signed in the heat of succession crises, and the primary sources that describe the growing sense of doom within the royal court. By providing this exhaustive detail, we see that the fall of the dynasty was not a sudden accident, but a slow-motion catastrophe that mirrored the 7-year trial of the Templars. The same state machine that had worked so efficiently to destroy the order was now consuming its own masters. The narrative of Part 3 serves as the bridge between the political crime of 1307 and the historical reckoning of the 100 Years' War, proving that in the theater of history, the final act is always determined by the choices made in the first. The legacy of the Knights Templar and the subsequent destruction of the Capetian dynasty did not merely conclude with the extinction of a royal bloodline, it fundamentally altered the DNA of Western statecraft and created a historical vacuum that would be filled by centuries of myth, revolutionary fervor, and the agonizing birth of the modern nation-state. To understand the final weight of this narrative, one must examine the forensic and documentary evidence that has resurfaced in the modern era, which serves to vindicate the last Grand Master not through legend, but through the cold recovery of lost administrative records. For nearly 700 years, the official narrative of the order's guilt was maintained by the combined weight of the French crown and the silence of the Vatican. However, in 2001, a discovery within the Vatican's secret archives provided the ultimate proof of the judicial murder orchestrated by Philip the Fair. The Chinon parchment, a document that had been misfiled and forgotten for centuries, revealed that Pope Clement V had actually absolved Jacques de Molay and the leadership of the Temple of all charges of heresy as early as 1308. This revelation confirms the ultimate secret that brought down kings. The highest spiritual authority on earth knew the order was innocent and that the charges of spitting on the cross and worshipping idols were fabrications of the royal court, yet he allowed the knights to be systematically tortured and burned to preserve his own political survival against the French king. The biological extinction of the direct Capetian line in 1328 was the catalyst for a century of chaos that nearly erased the concept of France from the map of Europe. The transition to the House of Valois was not a simple change of management, it was a rupture in the perceived divine order of the world. The 100 Years' War, which broke out just 9 years after the death of the last Capetian king, was the physical manifestation of the moral vacuum left by Philip the Fair's betrayal. The English King Edward III, as the grandson of Philip the Fair, held a legitimate legal claim to the throne that the Valois kings struggled to refute with any moral authority. This conflict saw the destruction of the French nobility at the battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, slaughters that contemporaries viewed as the continued collection of the debt of blood initiated on the Isle de Juifs. The curse had become a structural reality of the French state. The kingdom was subjected to the chevauchés of the Black Prince, the internal madness of King Charles VI, and the near-total collapse of social order, a sequence of events that mirrored the systematic dismantling of the Templar infrastructure. The gold seized from the Order's vaults had long since been spent on the very wars that were now destroying the kingdom. Furthermore, the destruction of the Templars fundamentally altered the financial landscape of the Renaissance. By eliminating the most stable and trustworthy international banking network in Christendom, Philip IV forced the European economy into the hands of the great Italian merchant houses of Florence and Siena. These institutions, such as the Bardi and Peruzzi, attempted to replicate the Templar system of letters of credit and transnational capital movement, but they lacked the military sovereignty and the papal protection that had made the Templars unique. These banking houses eventually suffered their own catastrophic collapses because they continued to lend to European monarchs who had learned from the French example that a king could simply default on his debts by accusing his creditors of crimes or by utilizing the reason of state to bypass legal obligations. The economic instability of the late 14th century, which contributed to the severity of the Great Famine and the impact of the Black Death, can be traced back to the destruction of the financial equilibrium that the Templars had provided. That secret was not an occult ritual, but the dangerous realization that a state could cannibalize its own vital organs for short-term political gain. The memory of Jacques de Molay also underwent a profound transformation, migrating from the legal archives of the Inquisition into the folklore of resistance against absolute power. During the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, the story of the Templars was resurrected as a symbol of the struggle against royal and clerical tyranny. When the Bastille was stormed and King Louis XVI was eventually led to the guillotine in 1793, the specter of the last Grand Master was invoked as a guardian of historical justice. While the legends of a man jumping onto the scaffold to shout, "Jacques de Molay, thou art avenged," are likely the product of revolutionary romanticism, they reflect a deep-seated cultural truth, that a dynasty built on the subversion of the law creates a ghost that haunts the state until the very institution of the monarchy is dismantled. The pyres of 1314 had lit a fire that would eventually consume the very throne that ordered them. The secret that brought down kings was the enduring power of the martyr to outlast the tyrant. In the modern era, the legacy of the Templars continues to be exploited by a myriad of secret societies, conspiracy theorists, and popular fiction, most of which focus on the fantasy of hidden treasures and holy relics. However, the technical documentary evidence points to a much more grounded and terrifying conclusion. The tragedy of the Templars is the ultimate case study in the birth of the absolute state, a state that recognizes no power higher than itself and no law other than its own survival. Philip the Fair was the first modern king, a man who understood that through the control of information, the use of state-sanctioned torture, and the manipulation of religious anxiety, he could liquidate any opponent, no matter how powerful. But history proves that his victory was a Pyrrhic one. His sons died, his dynasty vanished, and his kingdom was plunged into a century of darkness. The secret of the Templars is the secret of the limits of power. It is the realization that justice is not a luxury of the state, but its foundation, and without it, the tallest towers and the deepest vaults will eventually crumble into ash. As we conclude this investigation, we look back at the silent commanderies that still dot the landscape of France, the Temple in Paris, now gone, but its footprints still felt in the geography of the city. These stones are the only remains of a world that was sacrificed for gold and power. Jacques de Molay's final stand on the Isle de Juifs remains one of the most powerful moments of individual defiance in history, a moment where an old man, broken by 7 years of dungeon life, found the strength to reclaim his honor and deliver a summons that would dismantle the most powerful dynasty in Europe. The curse was not a magic spell, but a historical inevitability. When a king betrays his protectors, when a pope betrays his flock, and when a state betrays the law, the debt will always be called due. The fire that consumed the last Grand Master did not just destroy a man, it ignited a transformation of the world that we are still grappling with today. The debt is paid, the line of Philip the Fair is extinct, and the secret that brought down kings is finally laid bare in the light of history. The echoes of the execution of Jacques de Molay did not fade with the deaths of the kings who condemned him. Instead, they resonated through the centuries, transforming a cold act of state-sponsored liquidation into the most enduring haunting of Western civilization. To understand the final weight of this history, one must look at the physical and documentary evidence that has resurfaced in modern times, peeling away the layers of occult fantasy to reveal the even more terrifying reality of medieval power. For hundreds of years, the world believed the Templars were guilty simply because the official records of the French crown, written in the ink of the Inquisition, insisted they were. However, in the early 21st century, a discovery within the Vatican's secret archives fundamentally altered our understanding of the secret that brought down the order. The Chinon parchment, a document that had been misfiled for centuries, proved that Pope Clement V had actually absolved Jacques de Molay and the leadership of the Temple of all charges of heresy as early as 1308. This revelation confirms the ultimate betrayal. The Pope knew the order was innocent, yet he allowed them to be systematically tortured and burned to appease the political and financial demands of the French king. This document is the smoking gun of a judicial murder, a testament to a period where the highest spiritual authority on earth was held hostage by sovereign debt. The biological extinction of the direct Cape Tion line in 1328 was not the end of the tragedy, but the beginning of a century of chaos that nearly destroyed the concept of France itself. The transition to the House of Valois was marked by immediate internal strife and the arrival of the Black Death, a pandemic that found Europe already weakened by the economic instability caused by the Templars' fall. The absence of the Order's international banking network meant that there was no centralized mechanism to manage the massive economic contractions that followed the plague. The curse had manifested as a total systemic failure. The Hundred Years' War, which erupted as a direct result of the Cape Tion succession crisis, saw the French nobility decimated at the battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. The irony of history is profound. The very state that Philip the Fair sought to make the most powerful in the world was reduced to a fractured, occupied territory, its people suffering for generations under the weight of a conflict that was rooted in the betrayal of 1307. The gold seized from the Order's vaults had long since been spent on the very wars that were now destroying the kingdom, proving that wealth obtained through the subversion of justice carries a terminal interest rate. The geopolitical consequences of this collapse extended far beyond the borders of France, fundamentally altering the map of the world. Without the Templar fleet and their logistical support in the Mediterranean, the Christian presence in the East became even more precarious, leading to the final abandonment of the crusading ideal and the rise of the Ottoman Empire as the dominant power in the region. In Europe, the vacuum left by the Templars allowed other, less regulated financial powers to rise, but it also increased the frequency of localized conflicts that the Templars had once been able to mediate through their immense financial influence. The secret that brought down kings was the realization that absolute power, when exercised through the destruction of fundamental institutions, creates a systemic rot that cannot be cured by seized assets. As we look at the records of the French court in the years following 1314, we see a tragic parade of short-lived monarchs and a nobility that had lost its faith in the crown, leading to a breakdown of the social contract that would take centuries to repair. The memory of the Templars migrated from the legal archives into the folklore of secret societies and the esoteric traditions of the Renaissance, where the fantasy of hidden treasures and holy relics began to take root. While modern historians focus on the documented reality of their banking and military prowess, the cultural impact of their fall remains immense. During the French Revolution, nearly 500 years after the pyres on the Seine, the execution of King Louis XVI was viewed by some as the final settlement of the Templar debt. Legends even claim that as the guillotine fell, a voice from the crowd shouted, "Jacques de Molay, thou art avenged." While these stories are the product of revolutionary romanticism, they demonstrate the enduring power of the narrative. A state that builds its foundation on the blood of the innocent creates a ghost that it can never truly lay to rest. The pyre on the Isle de Juifs had lit a fire that would eventually consume the very concept of the absolute monarchy. The physical legacy of the order remains scattered across the landscape of Europe, silent, stone commanderies and massive fortresses that once held the wealth of nations. These structures serve as monuments to an era of internationalism that was destroyed by the birth of the absolute sovereign state. The tragedy of the last Grand Master is a timeless warning about the fragility of justice in the face of institutional greed. It reminds us that when the rule of law is subverted for the reason of state, the resulting rot eventually consumes the state itself. Philip the Fair won the battle for the Templar gold, but he lost the war for his dynasty's future. His sons died in rapid succession, his treasury remained plagued by corruption, and his kingdom was plunged into a century of darkness. The fire that consumed Jacques de Molay was the same fire that scorched the roots of the Capetian family tree, proving that some summons are indeed answered by the silent machinery of history. As we conclude this investigation into the secret that brought down kings, we are left with the image of an old man standing on a pyre in the middle of the Seine, choosing death over the lie of his own guilt. Jacques de Molay's final act of defiance was not a mystical curse, but a judicial one, a demand for the truth to be recognized in a court higher than any earthly king's. The history of the Templars is not a story of magic, but a documented account of how the world changed when the power of capital and the power of the sword were weaponized against the very faith that sustained them. The House of France paid the price in blood, the papacy paid the price in moral authority, and the Order of the Temple passed into the realm of eternal myth. The debt is settled, the pyres have long since grown cold, but the summons of 1314 remains a chilling reminder that the shadows of the past are never truly gone, they are merely waiting for the next time power decides to trade its soul for gold. The investigation into the fall of the dynasty reveals a pattern of institutional decay that was accelerated by the king's decision to weaponize the law against the temple. The subversion of the inquisitorial process, the use of state-sanctioned torture, and the manipulation of public opinion had created a culture of suspicion and fear that ultimately turned inward upon the royal court. The secrets of the Templar trials, the lies, the forced confessions, and the judicial murders, became the foundation of a new kind of statecraft, but one that lacked the moral legitimacy required for long-term stability. The House of France had traded its honor for a treasury full of gold, only to find that the gold could not buy the loyalty of the people or the survival of the bloodline. As we analyze the final years of the direct Capetians, we see a tragic reflection of the same violence that had been visited upon the Knights. The end of the dynasty was not a sudden event but a slow, agonizing dissolution that mirrored the 7-year imprisonment of Jacques de Molay. The final summons from the pyre had been answered, and the world was left to reckon with the wreckage of an empire that had tried to thrive on the destruction of its own foundations.